So today's video is going to be more of sort of an overview explanation of something that happened a little while ago in the financial industry. And it's more of something just some informational. It's not necessarily going to really help you in your financial plan, but it's kind of interesting to understand why something happened. And it's all going to revolve around the oil industry and the price of oil. So if you drive a car, you probably remember back in 2014 when oil was ungodly expensive. When the tank ran out, you had to go to the gas station. It was it was not a pleasant experience. It cost quite a bit of money, and well, it is still fairly expensive to go to the pump and fill up. It is markedly less cheap than it was back in 2014 when it was very expensive to buy oil. And so these are the prices of a barrel of oil. It's not a liter or a gallon if you're in the United States of gas. This is related to an actual barrel of it. So back in 2014, oil was around $116 a barrel. That's fairly high. Comparatively, in 2016, around the start of the year, it was at about $27 a barrel. And as you can see, that is a massive gap in price. And you may be wondering, how can it possibly have fallen so much over such a short period of time? Well, there were a number of political issues that transpired to create this sort of collapse in the value of the oil industry, and it was sort of an interesting reasoning and rationale on why it happened. And it actually all began with Obama, and during his term, he and the American government decided that they wanted to be self-sufficient when it came to oil. They didn't want to be reliant on the Middle East and other countries that produced oil to supply their economy. And so what they decided to do was they decided to invest in fracking, shale, offshore drilling in order to ensure that they had enough oil supply to ensure that the Americans and American companies had what they needed produced in the country. And there was a very specific reason they did this, and that's because they did not want to have Middle Eastern countries and other countries that produced oil to have a significant amount of political influence over them. What happens with the oil industry in the past is because Saudi Arabia and a number of other countries are so dominant in the oil industry, they have a lot of political power because of that. They can say, oh, you don't want to support us in this, or you want to go against us in that. Well, we do basically control the oil market. So on the side of the Americans, it was an attempt to sort of separate themselves so they didn't and weren't politically controlled at all by the Middle East and any other countries that produced a significant amount of oil. So could be perceived as a noble cause, a good thing to be separate and independent. But there was an issue, and the issue is the Saudis. The Saudis are by far the largest producer of oil. They have an incredible amount of power when it comes to the oil market, and they saw this as almost an attack on them. When you consider the Saudis and how much they control the oil market, they're filthy rich when it comes to their oil and the amount of money they have. It is an obscene amount of money, an obscene amount of wealth, to the point where it doesn't really matter significantly to them. What really does matter is the political power associated with the oil they have, the amount of power and influence they can impose by who they sell their oil to, how much they sell, at what price they sell. And when they see the Americans doing this, trying to break away from them, break away from their dependence on them, they see this as almost sort of an attack on them. So what did they do? Well, they said, whoa, you guys are trying to do something to control the oil market, to sort of influence it. I don't think you guys realize, but we're the big dogs here. We control the market. And so what they decided to do is they decided to undermine the US's effort to be independent when it came to oil. And how did they do this? They pumped the market full of oil. So if you're at all familiar with the idea of supply versus demand, typically you'll have a certain amount of people looking to buy something and a certain amount of people looking to sell something, and they will come together at an equilibrium. So let's say that equilibrium, to start with the amount of people wanting to buy oil, with the amount of people wanting to sell oil, is at $116 for a barrel of oil. Well, what happens is you have your demand over here. If your supply increases, someone else starts putting more oil into the market. The people that are demanding oil go, well, there's so much more oil now, I'm not going to pay you $116, maybe I'll pay you $100 for a barrel of oil. So the price changes because there's more supply. Then as more supply gets pushed into the market, there's more oil and more oil. Demand goes, well, there's so much more oil now, we can charge $60 for a barrel of oil. That's how much we'll pay for it. And that keeps on happening. The Saudis keep on pumping more and more and more oil into the market until a barrel of oil cost $27. Now, why did they do this? Why was this a very powerful move on their part? Well, it all comes into the cost that it takes to make a barrel of oil in America compared to Saudi Arabia. So, at the start of this sort of almost conflict when it comes to oil prices, in America it would cost in the realm of $50 to get a barrel of oil from fracking from the ground up to the surface. That doesn't include the refining process, distribution, or the sale of it. That's just to get a barrel of oil out of the ground up to the surface. Now, since this conflict has started, the Americans have gotten a lot more efficient, and an average is typically around $27 a barrel. And obviously, based on different areas, it's cheaper to get it out than others. And so you can see some places it's even closer to $5 a barrel in the most efficient, and it's more expensive in others. But comparatively, looking at how much it costs the Saudis to get a barrel of oil out of the ground, it's around $1. So they're very much different price points. So for the Saudis, even at $27 a barrel, if it's only costing them $1 to get it out of the ground, they're still making significant profits. They can easily do this for a very long period of time. But the Americans, they can't. They cannot make a profit at $27 a barrel. $27 a barrel. It's not possible for them. So for the past couple of years, what's been happening is the American government has been heavily subsidizing the oil industry in America. They've been giving them money kickbacks, tax breaks, pumping tons of money to try and keep them afloat, sort of keep this idea of American separation when it comes to oil. And so far, they've been keeping up. So far, they've sort of been able to achieve what they wanted to. But it's costing them a ton of money. And the issue is, for them, it's sort of they have a timeline for how long they can actually continue doing this. Even though they are getting more efficient, there's only so many things they can do to get to certain levels. For the Saudis, it's always going to be incredibly efficient to get oil out of the ground. And as I mentioned before, they're incredibly rich. The money doesn't really matter to them as much as the political influence that they can gain by having the US dependent on their oil. So they're likely to stay and keep on doing this until the Americans give up. The Americans, well, they're very patriotic and they really don't want to be under the Saudis' influence, so they're probably going to push as long as possible to keep this up. So realistically, the price of oil right now is around $45 a barrel. It's still, the U.S. Oil industry is still being subsidized. It's not as bad as it was when it was $27 a barrel. But this conflict is likely not to be resolved for a long period of time. They're still battling it out, and it's very unlikely the Saudis will give up. And the Americans probably won't give up anytime soon either. So it's probably going to continue. So, good thing for you if you're buying oil for your car at the pump. Probably not going to see significant price increases anytime soon. But looking at the global economic scheme, this has actually caused a lot of issues for a couple of different countries outside of this sort of power struggle between the Saudis and the Americans. First one, Canadians. Canada's economy has traditionally been propped up by oil, but specifically something known as oil sand and the oil sands. Oil sand is when there is oil, but it's actually mixed in with sand and it's in the ground, and it's even more expensive than fracking to get the oil separated from that sand. It is a very complicated and very expensive process. And again, when it was $116 a barrel, they made a lot of money in Canada. But right now, at $45 a barrel, they're hemorrhaging money. And they've had to shut down a lot of different areas, and it's been a huge burden on the Canadian economy, and specifically Alberta, the province where most of the oil is produced. It's been devastating for them. It hasn't ruined the country at all, for sure, but it's definitely had a very negative impact. Another country that's been significantly impacted, Russia. Russia actually produces a lot of their oil in their sort of Middle Eastern-ish areas of their country, and it actually represents a significant portion of their economy. And like Canada, they were significantly affected by these drops in oil prices. For them, it was actually even worse than Canada, and it had a significant impact on their dollar value, where they started seeing a spike in inflation, and it was fairly bad for them. But their economy is still plugging along. They weren't devastated by this. But one country that was basically brought to the brink of collapse and has effectively collapsed as an economy now is Venezuela. Venezuela is a country in South America that was almost totally reliant on oil for their income. Now, they were a mess of a country beforehand. They were socialist. and a number of other issues were associated with them, but they were being propped up by their oil money for a very long period of time. It helped them push through these issues that they had, underlying issues. But when oil fell off the map price-wise, it devastated their economy, and they've effectively collapsed as a country. When you consider that there are continuous riots in the country, gangs control significant portions of it now, it is a complete mess. And there's a number of other areas in the world that have been adversely affected by this, and unfortunately for those countries, Canada, Russia, Venezuela, as I mentioned before, the issue is not likely to get resolved anytime soon until one of the sides gives up, and it's highly unlikely either will decide to back down because both have a lot at stake outside of the oil money itself. Political influence, it's a huge part of this, what's going on, and it's interesting to see how much political maneuvering and decision-making can actually affect the economy. Obviously, it can have some effect, but in this instance, this battle between these two countries has resulted in a number of economies being severely hurt, and it's resulted in the collapse of an actual country. So political maneuvering can have massive effects when it comes to an economy, and hopefully this video sort of explained what's going on and what you can sort of expect in the future, and you can see what kind of influence politics actually does have on an economy. Now, one final thing to note, if you look at the price sort of drop from 116 to 27, that's a very significant drop. If you do the actual calculations, though, for how much gas you can buy at a pump during that same period of time, you'll notice that the same drop was not recognized in the actual value at the pump. And sort of what this highlights is, this is what happens when you have a couple to a few companies that control a market. When it comes to oil and oil distribution, there are only a few that actually are involved in it. And so even though the price fell off the map for oil, when you actually went to the pump and looked at what prices were at, it was definitely not proportionate in the changes. And that sort of just highlights what happens when you have only a couple companies control a market. They can set a price and they can basically do whatever they want. And that's sort of why oil prices didn't fall as significantly at the pump as it did on the market. So hopefully that explained a little bit about what happened to the oil prices, just a sort of a snapshot explanation of what went on and why it happened. And as always, if you like the content, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps me grow and provide more content in the future.